Pilots of Reddit, what has been a scary moment of which the passengers were blissfully unaware? Flocks of birds like to appear out of the grass when rolling down a runway for takeoff. It happens a lot more than passengers would like to know, but usually it's a non-event. Every once in a while though, that flock will appear right in front of us near rotation speed, and we just hope they're gone by the time we're moving through that space. Don't worry, if the plane crashes in the middle of the ocean you will most likely starve or drown. Got struck by lightning the other day. That wasn't fun. Scared the crap out of the both of us. Radar wasn't painting anything either. God booped you. I had just received my private pilot license and was flying around the area with my dad in a rented C-172. We had landed at a local airport to stop and use the restroom, get something to drink, etc. Well, in my noobish excitement, I had never retracted the flaps after landing. Didn't notice before taking off again. First sign of an issue was that the plane wanted to lift off much earlier than it should. I should have taken this as a cue that something was wrong, but I did not. I let the plane dictate what I was doing despite knowing something was off. We started the climb out. I finally noticed the flaps were at full. I immediately reached down and lifted the lever to fully retract them. That was my next mistake. The plane was now rapidly losing lift and I began to sink back down ominously close to the trees at the end of the runway. I flipped the lever back down to about halfway to stop the flaps from retracting further. This stopped my sink and I was able to gain some speed and resume climbing. When I was in the clear I finished retracting the flaps. My dad was completely unaware that I about flew us into some trees because I made a stupid rookie mistake. I didn't do the proper checks before takeoff. Furthermore, I let the plane dictate my actions despite knowing something wasn't right. I use that as a lesson in the future to never skip safety checks. A little off topic, but as a passenger on a flight from LAX to the main island of Hawaii on United Flight 83, I plugged my earbuds into the armrest and found the channel that let you listen to the pilots talking to the tower. About 100 miles out they were getting in line and the tower called us United 93. I got a cold chill. The pilots murmured. The tower called back referring to us as United 83, and everything moved along. I could just tell that anyone involved with that conversation just felt sick. If your captain is telling you to remain calm, because there is going to be some turbulence, then there is going to be some turbulence. But if he ends that sentence with cabin crew, be seated, then crap is about to go down. Probably will get buried, but whatever. I was giving a ride to a friend in a rental Cessna 172F. It was late in the day and the sun was going down. The airport I was heading to was only about 15 nautical miles away, but it was on the other side of a large body of water. We taxi up to the run-up pad and I test the engine like I do before every flight. Everything seems to look fine and normal. I taxi onto the runway, make my final checks, and proceed to take off. At that point I detect a small unusual vibration. I brushed it off like it was nothing. Small old airplanes vibrate all the time, so it's no surprise. As I'm climbing out, I'm looking at the tachometer and I glance down at the oil pressure and it's measuring lower than normal. I decide to turn base into an upwind. Pilot talk for turnaround while still in airport airspace. For the departure airport rather than riding it out over the lake. We're at about 1700 MSL, 800 featuring AGL, when the oil pressure falls below allowable limits. At this point I'm freaking out in my head because shoot's getting real fast. My passenger doesn't know anything is up because I'm not saying anything. The last thing I need is some guy freaking the heck out while I'm trying to land the plane without a usable engine. I calmly tell him, we need to turn around. My assumption is that I'm P-oil and I'm at a risk of fire, so I get on the Unicum airport radio frequency and declare an emergency landing. The others in the pattern exit and I end up doing right traffic to final. I pull the throttle to prevent any fire as I turn base to final while keeping enough airspeed to keep from stalling and crashing. I end up doing the approach too fast and landed the airplane on the last 500 featuring of the runway, nearly running off the end. I pulled to the taxiway and shut the engine down. Turns out the engine was grinding and making metal on the inside. Probably first time I was thankful for how excellent my instructors were when I was training. TLDR. Lost my engine during takeoff. Saved the airframe. And my passenger had no goddamn clue what was going on. That's the scariest experience I think I've seen on this thread. You win. Not a pilot, but I was a passenger when I overheard a flight attendant speaking to another saying they're gonna try flying over it. Shortly after, the pilot announced we would be experiencing some turbulence from a nearby storm. They weren't kidding. That crap hit the plane so hard we had to make an emergency landing in Louisiana. Apparently some electronics were damaged, so we had to switch planes. When I was a passenger on a flight we had to try to go over some turbulence. Ended up at 45k feet. Haven't flown in a few years, but I had my PPL for a couple years and only had a few incidents worthy of a story. On my second ever solo, while I was still a student pilot, I hit a pocket of air right after takeoff that threw my head into the ceiling hard enough to make me a little dizzy. Never told anyone about that. First trip home after getting me PPL, I was taxiing the plane to park and nearly took out a fence while my parents were watching me. I acted like I meant to get the wing within inches of it when my dad brought up how close I was. One time I had a guy in a helicopter completely cut in front of me right after I was given clearance to take off. I had just pushed the throttle and so it wasn't really close. But the best part of it was hearing the traffic controller lose his crap on the heli pilot. I miss flying. Not a pilot, but I was on a flight about a year and a half ago to Queenstown, NZ. Smooth flight there with little to no turbulence. All of a sudden on the approach to land we hear the call for everyone to strap in and for the flight attendants to be seated. We came into some crazy crosswinds. It took 3 attempts to land and still came in pretty much sideways. The pilot was super chill about it though, seemed like he had it under control. Sounds like situation normal in NZ. A few of my college roommates were commercial pilot majors. It was not uncommon to be woken up on a Saturday and told we are flying 6 states away today. One particular time I remember being about 10,000 feet over the Mississippi River when my friend Paul says, "Hey, look at that," just before stalling the engine and falling 1,000 feet in a matter of seconds. All the while he is fighting the choke, and I watched as the propeller stopped. It is not a good feeling to have been flying for 3 hours with the constant roar of the plane engine not 4 feet in front of you, to sudden engine silence and a deafening roar of wind going by as you are falling hundreds of feet per second. Freaked the frick out of me, but apparently reactivating a stalled aircraft is something you must do to get a license. He did it 3 more times that day. It's not actually the engine that stalls, it's the wings and the airflow around them. I get what you're saying, but I guess just for your information. Military pilot here. Can't speak for my commercial bros, but most things that break are minor, and for the more serious crap your pilot is more than overqualified to handle it. From my experience sharing airspace with the bus drivers, most airliners will take precautions to make sure a bad situation, though minor, doesn't get worse. That is, my buddy's flight across the pond came back for a bad smell in the cockpit. Maybe something is burning. Maybe somebody had a particularly acrid fart. Who knows? Most times my crew is unaware the particulars of how close we came to smashing that bird I narrowly avoided. Could count the feathers on that sucker. Large commercial planes have MMELs hundreds of pages long, essentially a list of failures that can be tolerated when dispatched. Further failures may occur in flight and it may still be perfectly safe to fly. For anyone who's curious, there is an interesting series called Mayday Air Crash Investigation which details many of the terrible crashes and accidents over the years. I have a terrible fear of flying, but honestly seeing these and how they corrected the issues has helped me to get over it. So many safety issues were corrected and created to solve the problems over the years, but some of them still just horrify me. Not a pilot, but I do work for an airline. I was doing a project at our base in LGA and had to fly home to my native Indianapolis, and my only option was to deadhead with a few crew members from my airline back home. I was sitting by myself in first class on an empty plane, save for one pilot, 3 flight attendants, plus the 2 guys flying the plane. Upon landing, we hit the runway really hard and bounced. I didn't think anything of it, as I've flown on airplanes hundreds of times. However, the captain flying the plane looked white as a ghost and told me he almost flipped us. Not a pilot, but I was once a passenger on a particularly scary landing in New Orleans. We were flying through the darkest, scariest rainstorm I could imagine, with a lot of turbulence. It was scary enough that we just seemed to keep turning and turning. but I couldn't see the end of the wing out the window due to the rain. When the wheels hit pavement and we started toward the gate, everyone started turning on their cell phones. It was like a great chorus went up as each one connected and immediately made the tornado alert sound. We'd landed during a tornado warning. Was flying into Denver once, and the turbulence was horrible on our descent. I can see the landing and we get maybe 50 feet from the ground, and suddenly the plane heads back up again. A tornado had dropped down right next to the airport. We rerouted to Albuquerque and had to wait a couple hours there for the weather to change. I was one of those people who cried. OT, but those of you who suffer with every bump in an aircraft, never accept a seat in the rear of the plane. Movement is noticeably accentuated back there. I was in a rearmost seat last year when my flight hit nasty turbulence and it felt like a carnival ride. OP, your question reminded me of a webcomic I saw one time where the pilot comes over the intercom and says, "This is your captain speaking. There is no reason to be alarmed." The looks at the co-pilot and says that'll get them going. Late as frick, but my dad once had one engine quit on his Embraer. Didn't even tell the passengers if I remember correctly. He also told me a story of a Super 80, I think, that literally lost an engine. The pilots were like, crap, engine 2 stopped working, but after a passenger spoke to a flight attendant, the flight attendant let the pilots know that they had in fact literally lost it. It fell off. Can't remember the deets, but I'd love to be the passenger in the back window seat and suddenly getting to actually have a view instead of only seeing an engine. Approaching VR and someone starts to cross the runway you are on. Turned short final on runway 36R and hear tower mistakenly give clearance for someone to roll on 26. We went around and right over the top of who had been clearance to roll. Small plane pilot, so no passengers. But here is the story of why I don't fly with my friend who owns a plane anymore. 1. Friend decides that clouds traditionally only exist over this particular airport, like the clouds over the Addams family house, and we can get out no problem. I went along and we ended up in total whiteout, inadvertent IMC conditions. Colder died. Ended up landing 150 miles from home, staying in a days inn where 75% of rooms rented by pimps. 2. Fly down the coast to Florida. Sure. End up scud running the coast of Maryland. Almost hitting a Ferris wheel. Had to get special clearance through military space. Wallops. To maintain marginal at best VFR. 3. Flying across Florida. 9 AM is great, no problems. But T-storms pop around midday like clockwork. Dude refuses to get up, motivate to do the flight early. End up taking off around 11:30 AM. End up under Orlando's Class B airspace. Heavy is above, and the best part? We get caught in an updraft. Almost stall out and spend 40 minutes weaving through thunderheads because we have on-board weather. 4 again, drags his feet for on-time departure. End up at airport and he wants to go. Lightning strikes on the field and reported downbursts in the vicinity. But it stops raining and he's all, let's go. He jawboned tower into taxiing us out when they didn't want. Then watched a tree at one end of the airport get zapped from the cockpit before tower chased us back to the FBO saying, don't let me hear from you for at least 2 hours. I spent a ton of money to get my pilot's license and fly with a friend who is lucky enough to have a plane. Decided I prefer living. Probably won't use my license again until I hit the lottery. But I'm alive after all his shenanigans and my own stupidity not standing up for proper safety and ADM. And that's probably used up all my odds beating karma. Late to the game on this one, but I was a passenger on a pretty scary flight experience. I was coming back into LaGuardia from Florida late at night. Most of the people on the plane were asleep when the loudspeaker comes on and the pilot literally yells, everyone be seated and buckle up. That was it. Everyone was wide awake and the flight attendants were obviously rattled. Within 30 seconds the plane nosedived, which is the worst feeling ever. This continued until we were mere feet above buildings in Atlantic City. I remember thinking we could jump out on top of the Borgata and be fine. At this point everyone is crying and on their phones and the stewardesses are freaking out. Everyone thought the plane was hijacked as we were heading towards NYC. Of course, as luck would have it, we also landed on the runway at LaGuardia that is right on the edge of the water and it looks like you're going to crash into the water. While we were pulling into the gate, the pilot finally came over the loudspeaker again apologizing apologizing for the disturbing flight as the windshield shattered at 25,000 feet and they had to nosedive to avoid the cabin losing pressure. Scary crap. Whoa, that sounds very dang uncommon to have a windshield shatter. Dang. 10-hour flight from Paris to Chicago. Right as they finished serving all of the meals we got the call for some heavy turbulence. Being extremely hungover, the next hour of violent shaking, drinks spilling, food tossed onto the floor, was not enjoyable. As someone who's very nervous about flying, I thought I'd regret reading this, but I actually found the lack of the plane went into a nosedive and people were only complaining about their drinks spilling, but we recovered. LOL. Comforting. I used to be terrified of flying. A lot of my anxiety stems from lack of control. I don't see the person flying the plane. I don't know what's going on. However, the more I fly, and the more I read about flying, the less I am afraid. I always remember the pilots want to live as well. Also, vodka and orange juice is amazing. First story. Went to England from US 747, and when the pilot landed he hit hard, all the masks came out of the planes overhead. Second, I flew into the Detroit airport and evidently they needed to fly low for about 5 minutes on approach. The turbulence was horrible. The roller coaster ride on approach and being able to see houses and cars and such was kinda scary. I just gritted my teeth. I love the window seat and watching the flaps deploy, and even the wing flex is something that I think is amazing. Still fly to this day and agree the most dangerous trip is to the airport. It anyone answering a question posed to a very specific profession. Not a pilot, but my dad is an airplane mechanic. Little backstory. This was a long time ago when I was a kid. My mom has always been a nervous flyer. My dad obviously isn't and would tease her a bit. My sisters and I had been flying since we were babies and gave no shoots. My dad liked to drop little "that's not supposed to do that" to my mom to mess with her, but it was never serious or not even the slightest issue, to my understanding. Also, since we had been flying our whole lives, it was often that despite being underage, we wouldn't always be seated with our parents because we flew standby. We were all very well behaved though, so it was never an issue. One day, we're flying. I don't remember how far into the flight we were again. I was probably under 10 years old, but suddenly there was a noise. A distinct noise to my child brain. My elephant loving child brain. A loud elephant trumpet. Noise they make with their trunks, whatever that's called, sounded throughout the cabin. My elephant loving self was like, oh my god, there's an elephant on board internally, though I think I knew there wasn't. I just loved elephants that much and was so excited to hear their noise outside of a zoo. So I'm giggling and grinning. My mom on the other hand was freaked out. Apparently, my dad decided to not say anything about the noise. He knew something was wrong. Probably exactly what was wrong, but didn't want to really freak my mom out, nor lie to her. I don't think she asked him either, but she knew because he said nothing that it was probably serious. I don't remember if anything happened or was different during the flight, besides our rough landing. After we landed, our pilot told us the noise was the hydraulics going out, or failing, or something, and we landed fine. But we now have to be taxied in, which takes forever, but I didn't care cause elephants. I was a passenger on a flight last year, early 2016. Not sure from O'Hare to Miami or the other way around. Daytime. I was sitting by the window on the left side behind the wing. Decided to open the blind and take a look. The only thing I saw was this aircraft flight left to right below us. I saw it almost full sized, so it couldn't be too far below us. It freaked me out a little. I did not see any other passenger bothered by the close flyby. If any noticed, probably the pilots saw it on the radar. I thought you were going to say you opened the blind and saw something on the wing. Not a pilot, but at the airport all flights were delayed due to storms. Our pilot was the first to take off and probably one of the only that day. We ended up pretty much flying through a tornado. The turbulence was the worst thing I've ever experienced. Nearly everybody was getting sick and throwing up. As someone who throws up if I see, hear or smell throw up, this is probably the most horrifying thing here. I hate throwing up. I think it's peanuts against what people have written here, but the worst thing was when I suddenly flew into a pocket of downward air in my sailplane over the Alps. I think that at one point I've been about 20 meters over the trees. That was a bit of my own fault though, because I flew close on purpose to impress my girlfriend, and impressed she was. Never seen her happier than when she was in that plane. I've flown something close to 2 million miles, but I've only had one flight where I was legitimately scared. The turbulence was like nothing else I've ever experienced, and the captain started briefing us every 5 minutes. Even then, I was still okay, but then the captain said, with real concern in his voice, thus ending my bliss, "Well, that didn't work. We're going to try something else." Then the plane nosed down really frighteningly sharply. We were all semi-weightless for maybe 30 seconds. I was flying an old Cessna 172 into Harbor Springs with my dad as my passenger to my right. We were riding up drafts from the wind off of Lake Michigan coming up the trees. The second we get past the first tree line, the updrafts stop and we start sinking fast. At this point I've got full power and try to pitch up enough to at least maintain level flight with the stall horn starting to chirl in the background. With the airspeed picking back up, I begin to stabilize the approach and bring it down. Once on the ground, my dad was none the wiser on how close we were to being another statistic. Story from my uncle. Take off on a runway after a weekend coin convention. Get to the part where you're in the air, but maybe 50 feet or less up, and notice you aren't climbing at all. Also, there are trees at the end of the runway. The wheels are still down, but you can't retract them because that makes for more drag. When you open the doors to pull in the wheels, and you hit the trees, well, it turns out that the standard weight estimates don't work so well when it's a bunch of guys that collect coins. So, you stare at the trees and hope for the best. This will get buried, but whatever. I was a passenger on a plane that was going in for its final landing approach, and then all of a sudden, the pilot hit the accelerator full speed and pulled up sharply. He called it a missed landing due to a software glitch. I have a funny feeling he was about to hit something or someone and aborted at the last minute. I wish I didn't get airsickness so badly that I had to close the window shade. I would have loved to have seen what he was about to hit before pulling the panic lever. My cab ride to the airport. Seriously, guys, the drive on the highway is dramatically more dangerous than anything that'll happen to you on the flight. Airplanes are really safe. Somali cab drivers, not so much. A fellow Minnesotan I see, Somali here, laughed at your joke. Not a pilot, but when I was younger I was on a flight to Hawaii from Atlanta. They had to make an emergency landing at LAX and a bunch of men came on with dogs and security wands. Turns out there was a bomb threat. Not a pilot but passenger. Shortly after takeoff the pilot announces, we are going to have to turn around. We have a small problem with the landing wheels. They are stuck. Small pause. Luckily, they are stuck outside. So we turn around and land without problems. But I notice we had the whole cavalry waiting for us. Fire trucks, ambulances and whatnot. Guess they didn't trust those wheels 100%. LOL. On approach with 2 packs we had the left low hydraulic flow light flicker when we put app flaps in. Okay, fine. So we put the gear down a little sooner than we had planned. Get 3 down and locked. No reason to tell them as what's it really going to help other than make them nervous. Now the next problem is our brakes are also hydraulically actuated. If the system is bleeding itself we may have to depend on reversing to stop us. We decide to try and get flaps to full to at least reduce rollout speed. Both lights are now permanent. We touch down and lightly check the brakes. Both brakes are holding pressure so we were able to clear and get to the ramp. All in all it ended up with the packs hopping out asking what that red trail was. Sure enough we had a trail of HID fluid solid enough you could trace our path from the runway to the ramp. The primary line had crap itself and was not so slowly draining our reservoir. They popped a bottom inspection panel off the engine and luckily had a bucket as it dropped the last quart or 2. I've never seen a plane bleed like that. I was waiting for my girlfriend's flight to come in, saw her plane come in for a landing without its gear down, crossed over the airport's fence, lined up with runway, then it pulled out and up. It came back, landing gear down and landed. I called her a few minutes later and it was her flight. The pilot said it was crosswinds. Just learning for my PPL, like, my second or third lesson, less than 10 takeoffs under my belt. Power up. airspeed, rotate, all that jazz went perfectly. Then a bird passes us at no more than 2 feet off the wing spar, and not some sparrow, like a full friggin' eagle. Probably would have broken something on the 172 if we made contact. Scared the crap out of me. The instructor didn't see it. Not a whole lot honestly. Near miss encounters are by far the worst feeling. I was diver driving one day and the engine made some stutter a few times. I adjusted something to see if that might have been the cause, and one of the jumpers was looking at me. He knew. The rest didn't. This question kind of goes against everything that transport pilots are trained to do. Safety is the airline's only priority because of how easy it is for them to get sued. In the USA, the pilots have very little motivation to push the limits either. They will certainly lose their license, face criminal charges, and be personally liable if anything happens. Browsing through the comments backs this up. Most of the stories are general aviation stuff, which does happen all the time. Late to the party, but anyway, I fly a 206 out in the sticks of northwestern Ontario with communities being few and far in between. I had a nose wheel issue where it remained compressed after takeoff, therefore still connected to the rudder. Not too long after getting airborne, the rudder goes hard over to full deflection. 1 hour of having both feet on the opposite rudder to keep her level, we land without trouble, and as we're getting out the passengers say, "Hey, that was a great flight." Also had a main bearing fail on the crank. Flew 6 hours that day and noticed pressure was a little low. Mentioned it to the AIMS at the end of the day, and when they checked it they said it would have stopped at any second. Not the scariest moment of my career, but yesterday we were descending into the airport through some clouds, and our engine bleed valve decided to take a crap on us, setting off the master warning light telling us that we were in icing conditions with the anti-icing system inoperative. Not a huge deal as long as you can find your way out of the clouds, but the master warning light always has a way of grabbing your attention and waking you up. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.